It started with one sound. I was already awake when it happened, staring into the dark and listening to a kind of silence that felt too complete. There was no wind outside, no distant traffic, nothing that could fill the space between sounds. That was why the noise stood out immediately, even though it was quiet. It wasn't a bang or a crash or anything obvious. It was a step. Just one at first, soft and measured, like someone placing their foot carefully on the floor. I remember not moving at all. I didn't sit up or reach for my phone. I just stayed there, listening, trying to decide if I had actually heard something or if my mind was filling in the quiet. The place I was in wasn't supposed to have sounds like that. It was a small cabin, tucked far enough away from the nearest road that even during the day it felt disconnected. I had come out there for exactly that reason. No interruptions, no noise, no one else. At least, that's what I thought. I held my breath for a moment, waiting. Nothing came after it. The silence settled back in so naturally that it almost convinced me I imagined the whole thing. Almost. I shifted slightly under the blanket, the fabric sounding louder than it should, and listened again. That's when I heard the second one. It was further away this time. Or maybe I just noticed the distance more. Another step, same pace, same careful weight. Not random. Not the kind of creak an old place makes when it settles. This had intention behind it. I remember thinking that word clearly, even though I tried to ignore it. Intention. I told myself it could be an animal. Something small, moving around outside the cabin. Maybe the sound was traveling through the walls, in a strange way. Maybe it wasn't even footsteps at all. But I didn't fully believe any of those explanations. The problem was how clear it had sounded. How deliberate. I glanced toward the door, barely visible in the dark, and felt a quiet pressure in my chest that I couldn't explain. I knew I should probably get up, check the place, make sure everything was as empty as I thought it was. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. Instead, I stayed where I was, staring into the dark, listening for something I wasn't sure I wanted to hear again. Because if it happened again, if I heard it clearly, I knew I wouldn't be able to pretend it was nothing anymore. So I waited, completely still and silent. The kind of silence that feels wrong. The longer I lay there, the more aware I became of how quiet everything really was. Not just the kind of quiet you notice for a moment and then forget, but something deeper than that. It felt stretched out, like the space around me had expanded too far, leaving everything distant and disconnected. Even my own breathing sounded out of place, like it didn't belong in that room. I tried to remind myself why I had come there in the first place. The cabin was supposed to be isolated. That was the appeal. It sat miles away from anything. No nearby houses. No main road close enough to hear. No passing lights through the windows at night. I had checked all of that before arriving. Even my phone had lost signal halfway through the drive, which at the time had felt like a relief. Now it didn't. I turned my head slightly, looking toward the door again. I remembered locking it. I was sure of that. I could still picture the motion, clearly pushing it shut, turning the key, even testing the handle once just to be certain. The windows were the same. Small, narrow, the kind that barely opened enough for air. I had closed them before going to bed, mostly out of habit. Everything had been sealed, controlled, safe. That was what made the silence feel wrong. It wasn't empty in a peaceful way. It wasn't the kind of quiet that helps you sleep. It felt like something was missing. Like there should have been background noise that just wasn't there. No insects outside. No shifting wood from the structure. Nothing natural to balance it out. Just a stillness that pressed in from every direction. I pulled the blanket closer without really thinking about it. The fabric moved softly, but even that small sound seemed to disappear too quickly, swallowed by the space around me. I listened again, more carefully this time, trying to pick up anything that could ground me. A breeze, a branch against the wall, something ordinary. There was nothing, but the memory of those footsteps didn't fade the way I expected it to. It stayed sharp, almost too clear, like it had just happened. I could still hear the rhythm of it in my head, the spacing between each step, the weight behind it. It didn't feel like something my mind had invented. If anything, it felt more real the longer I thought about it. I tried to distract myself. I focused on small details, the way the ceiling looked in the dark, the faint outline of furniture, the texture of the wall across from me. Normal things, familiar things. I told myself that if I kept my attention there, the feeling would pass. It didn't. Instead, something shifted in the way the silence felt. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It felt like it was waiting, like it was holding itself in place, just long enough for me to notice it. And that was the part I couldn't explain. Trying to explain it away, I stayed like that for a while, listening to nothing, until the silence itself started to feel louder than any noise could have been. At some point, I realized I wasn't going to relax unless I did something about it. Lying there, Waiting for another sound wasn't helping. If anything, it was making everything worse. So I told myself to be rational. Old places make noise. Wood shifts, temperature changes. It was a cabin, not a modern house. There were probably dozens of small sounds happening all the time that I normally wouldn't notice. I had just picked one out of the silence and let my mind turn it into something more than it was. That had to be it. I pushed the blanket aside and sat up slowly, letting my feet touch the floor. The wood was colder than I expected. I stayed still for a second, listening again, half expecting something to react to the movement. Nothing did. I stood up and took a few steps across the room, deliberately placing my weight down the same way I remembered hearing it. Slow, careful. I listened closely as I walked, trying to compare the sound of my own footsteps to what I had heard earlier. They didn't match. Mine were softer, less defined. The floor gave slightly under my weight, producing a faint creak that lingered for a second before fading. What I had heard before hadn't creaked like that. It had been cleaner, more controlled. I paused, then tried again, this time adjusting the way I stepped. Slower, then faster. Heel first, then flat. I even walked toward the walls, thinking maybe the sound had echoed in a way that changed how it reached me. Still nothing lined up. I told myself it didn't matter. Sound traveled strangely in quiet places. It could bounce, distort, shift depending on angles and surfaces. Just because I couldn't recreate it perfectly didn't mean it wasn't something normal. I moved toward the door and rested my hand on the handle. It felt exactly the way I remembered it. Still locked. I gave it a slight push anyway, just to confirm, and it held firm. The windows were the same when I checked them. Closed. Secured. No signs of anything being disturbed. I even listened at the door for a moment, pressing my ear against the wood. If something had been outside, mobbing around, I should have been able to hear it more clearly from there. There was nothing. That should have reassured me, but it didn't. If anything, it made things more confusing. An animal would have made more noise. Scratching, shifting, something uneven. What I had heard was consistent. Measured, almost careful. I stepped back from the door and stood in the middle of the room, trying to steady my thoughts. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I had taken one small sound and built something bigger out of it because of where I was and how quiet it felt. That made more sense than anything else. I repeated that to myself a few times, letting it settle, trying to believe it fully. Eventually, I nodded slightly, like I had convinced myself enough to move on. But even as I turned away, heading back toward the bed, I caught myself listening again, more carefully than before, as if part of me was waiting for something to prove me wrong. The second time was closer. I didn't even make it back to the bed. It happened again, cutting through the silence so cleanly that I stopped mid-step without thinking. This time, there was no doubt. No hesitation, no question of whether I imagined it. I heard it, clearly. A footstep. Closer. It wasn't distant like before. It wasn't something I had to focus on to catch. It was right there, somewhere just beyond the room I was standing in. Slow, controlled. The kind of movement that didn't belong to anything random. I felt my body lock in place, every muscle tightening at once, as if moving might somehow draw attention. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath again until my chest started to ache slightly. All I could do was listen. Another step followed. The spacing between them was the same as before. Measured, intentional. But now I could hear more detail in it. The faint pressure of weight meeting the floor. The slight pause before the next movement. Like whoever or whatever was making the sound was taking its time. I turned my head slowly toward the door, not fully moving my body, just enough to align my hearing. The sound didn't come from outside. I was certain of that now. It wasn't muffled by walls or distance. It carried too clearly, too directly. It was inside. That realization didn't hit all at once. It crept in, piece by piece, as I tried to place where the sound was coming from. I listened for echoes, for any sign that it might be reflecting off something, but there was none. It had a direction, a path. It sounded like it was moving along the hallway just beyond the door. Another step, slightly closer again. My eyes stayed fixed on the door now, watching it even though I knew I wouldn't see anything through it. The handle didn't move. The frame stayed perfectly still, but the sound didn't lie. Something was there, on the other side, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it already knew the layout of the place. I tried to think logically again, to force my mind back into something grounded. Maybe someone had followed me without me realizing. Maybe the lock hadn't caught properly. Maybe I had missed something obvious earlier when I checked. But none of those thoughts felt solid anymore. They felt rushed, like excuses I was trying to grab before something worse settled in. The footsteps continued. Not rushing, not stumbling, just steady, careful movement. There was no attempt to hide the sound, but there was no carelessness in it either. It didn't feel accidental. It felt aware. I stayed completely still, barely even shifting my weight, afraid that even the smallest movement might change something. The silence between each step stretched longer now, making it harder to predict when the next one would come. Every second felt drawn out, heavy with anticipation. Then it stopped. Not gradually, not fading. It death, just in death. The absence of it was immediate, and somehow worse than the sound itself. I waited, listening harder than before, trying to catch even the smallest trace of movement. Nothing came. The silence returned, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt occupied. I swallowed slowly, my eyes still fixed on the door, and for the first time since I had heard that initial sound, I stopped trying to explain it away, because there was only one conclusion left that made sense. I wasn't alone. Checking the house, I don't remember deciding to move. It just happened, like my body understood something before I fully did. Standing there, staring at the door, waiting for the sound to come back wasn't an option anymore. Not knowing felt worse. I stepped forward slowly, each movement controlled, careful not to make more noise than necessary. The floor responded under my weight with soft, familiar creaks, but now every sound felt amplified, like it carried further than it should. I reached the door and paused, my hand hovering near the handle without touching it. For a second, I just listened. Nothing. The silence sat on the other side, just as thick as it was in the room behind me. I wrapped my fingers around the handle and turned it slowly, trying to minimize the sound. The lock clicked open, louder than I expected, and I winced slightly at the sharpness of it. Then I pulled the door inward, just enough to see into the hallway. Dark. Still. I opened it wider and stepped out. The hallway stretched in both directions, narrow and plain, just like I remembered. There were no windows here, no natural light, just a faint outline of walls and doors leading into other rooms. Everything looked exactly the same. That should have been reassuring. It wasn't. I stood there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, scanning for anything out of place. The floorboards, the walls, the doors, nothing obvious stood out. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got stronger the longer I looked. I took a step forward, then another. Each step felt heavier now, like I was moving through something thick, something that resisted me in a way I couldn't explain. I moved toward the first door on the left, the one that led to a small storage room. I remembered closing it earlier, making sure it was shut all the way. Now, it wasn't wide open, just slightly off, barely noticeable unless you were paying attention. The gap between the door and the frame was small, but it was enough. I stopped in front of it, staring at that narrow opening. Maybe I hadn't closed it properly before. That was possible. Easy to overlook. I told myself that as I reached out and pushed it open the rest of the way, the hinges made a low, drawn-out sound that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. Inside, everything looked normal. Boxers stacked against the wall, tools where I remembered them. Nothing disturbed. Nothing missing. I stepped inside anyway, kustabe sure, checking corners, scanning the floor. There was nowhere to hide in a room that small. Nowhere for anything to be without me seeing it. Still, nothing. I backed out slowly and closed the door behind me, pressing it firmly until it sat flush with the frame. This time, I made sure. I continued down the hallway, moving toward the main living area. The open space made it easier to see, but that didn't make it feel any safer. Shadows sat in the corners where the light didn't reach properly, stretching just enough to create shapes that didn't hold still when I looked at them too long. I checked everything. The kitchen, the chairs, the counter. I ran my hand along the surface, half expecting to feel something different, something that didn't belong. But it was all the same. Clean, undisturbed. Except for one thing. A chair near the table was slightly angled away from where I remembered leaving it. Not by much, just enough to make me stop and look at it twice. I tried to picture it clearly in my mind, the way it had been earlier, but the image wasn't solid anymore. It slipped just enough to leave doubt. I adjusted it back without thinking, aligning it with the table the way it should have been. Then I stepped back. The room stayed quiet. I moved toward the far end, checking the last door, the one leading to the bathroom. Closed. Exactly how I left it. I opened it anyway. Slower this time, bracing for something I couldn't define. Nothing. Just the same empty space, unchanged. I stood there for a moment, then turned back toward the center of the cabin. Everything had been checked. Every room, every corner. There was nowhere for anyone to be. I swallowed and forced myself to speak, my voice low but clear. Hello. The word felt strange as soon as it left my mouth, like it didn't belong in that space. It carried further than I expected, echoing faintly down the hallway before fading into the silence. No answer came, not even a shift, not a breath. Nothing responded. And somehow, that made it worse. Because the silence that followed wasn't empty anymore. It felt heavier than before, like it had absorbed the sound and settled deeper into the space around me. The footsteps stop. When I move, I stayed where I was after my voice faded, listening to the way the silence settled again. It felt thicker now, like it had weight, like it was pressing down on everything around me. For a few seconds, nothing happened. No movement, no sound. Just that same heavy stillness filling the space. Then I shifted my foot slightly. It wasn't intentional, just a small adjustment to my balance, the kind of movement you don't think about. The floor creaked softly under me, a familiar sound now. I froze again immediately, listening out of instinct more than anything. Nothing. I waited, counting the seconds in my head without meaning to. 1, 2, 3, longer than it had been between the earlier footsteps. I started to wonder if maybe it was over, if whatever I had heard before had stopped for good. Then it came back, a single step somewhere behind me this time. I didn't turn around right away. I didn't move at all. My body locked up again, but this time it felt different. Sharper, more focused. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was paying attention. Another step followed, slow and deliberate. I felt a chill run through me, not from the temperature, but from the way it happened. It hadn't started until I stopped moving. The moment the cabin went still again, the sound returned. I stayed frozen, listening harder than I had before. The footsteps continued, spaced out evenly, moving somewhere along the hallway I had just walked through. Not rushing, not stumbling, just passing. I swallowed slowly, trying to keep my breathing quiet. Then, carefully, I lifted my foot and took one step forward. The sound stopped instantly. No delay, no fading. It just ended the moment my weight touched the floor. I stood there, staring ahead, my heart beating louder than anything else now. I didn't need to turn around to know what that meant. I could feel it settling in, piece by piece, the same way the earlier realization had. I stayed still again. For a moment, nothing happened. Just silence. I almost convinced myself it was a coincidence, that I was connecting things that weren't actually related. Then another step echoed behind me. Slow, measured, clear. I closed my eyes for a second, just to focus on the sound without anything else distracting me. It was the same rhythm as before, the same careful pacing. But now, there was something else underneath it. Something harder to ignore. Awareness. I opened my eyes again and shifted my weight deliberately this time, testing it. The footsteps stopped. I waited, completely still, letting the silence stretch out again. They started. I stepped forward once more. They stopped. A tight feeling settled in my chest, heavier than anything I had felt so far. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was understanding. Whatever was making that sound wasn't random. It wasn't the house settling or an animal moving through the walls. It was reacting to me. I didn't need to see it to know that anymore. The pattern was too exact, too consistent to ignore. Every time I moved, it went kit. Every time I stayed still, it continued, as if it was listening, as if it was waiting for me to stop. I stood there in the middle of the cabin, caught between wanting to move and not wanting to hear it again, realizing that the silence I had been trying to rely on wasn't empty at all. It was sure. Almost seen something. I don't know how long I stood there, locked between moving and listening, but eventually the tension became too much to hold. I couldn't stay frozen forever. At some point, had to either leave or find out what was actually there. I chose to move. Slowly, carefully, I took a step toward the hallway again. The moment my foot touched the floor, the sound behind me stopped, just like before. The silence returned instantly, filling the space as if nothing had ever been there. I kept going anyway, one step at a time, controlled and deliberate. I made my way back, toward the hallway entrance. My eyes adjusted to the darkness as much as they could, picking up faint outlines and edges, but nothing clear enough to focus on. The shadows seemed deeper now, stretching further than they should, bending slightly around corners where the light couldn't reach. I stopped just before the hallway and listened. Nothing. I told myself to just look, Just step forward, check it again, confirm that it was empty like everything else had been. That was all it would take. But something about the way the darkness sat in that space made it harder than it should have been. I leaned slightly, just enough to change my angle without fully stepping in. That's when I saw it. Not clearly. Not enough to define it. But something moved. A shift in the shadow. Near the far end of the hallway. Subtle enough that I might have missed it if I hadn't been staring directly at that spot. I froze immediately. My eyes locked onto where it had happened. Trying to make sense of it. Trying to see it again. For a second, nothing changed. The hallway looked exactly the same as before. Empty. Still. Then something blocked the faint light for just a fraction of a second, like a shape passing in front of it. My breath caught, but I didn't move. I didn't even blink. It was gone just as quickly as it appeared. I tried to convince myself it was my eyes adjusting, some trick of the darkness or the angle I was standing at, but the feeling that came with it didn't match that explanation. It felt too precise, too intentional. I shifted my weight slightly, without stepping forward. The hallway stayed quiet. No footsteps. No movement. Just that same heavy stillness, pressing into the space between me and whatever had just moved. I looked toward the storage room door again, the one I had already checked. It was still closed, exactly how I had left it, but now it didn't feel the same. None of it did. I could feel it building in my chest, that need to know, to just walk forward and open every door again, to force the truth out into the open, but I didn't. I stayed where I was, staring into the hallway, waiting for something to happen, instead of making it happen myself. Because a part of me understood something I didn't want to admit. If I stepped forward, if I actually confronted it, there was no going back to doubt, and as long as there was doubt, I could still pretend it wasn't real. Realizing it was inside before me, I kept staring into the hallway, long after the movement disappeared, trying to convince myself I had imagined it. But something had already shifted in the way I was thinking. It wasn't just fear anymore, it was doubt. But not the kind that made things easier to dismiss. It was the kind that made everything I had already experienced feel less certain. I slowly stepped back from the hallway, not turning my back to it completely, just enough to put a little distance between me and that space. My mind kept circling the same question, over and over, but each time it came back slightly different. What if it didn't just get there? What if it had been there the whole time? The thought didn't hit all at once. It built slowly, connecting to things I hadn't paid attention to earlier. Small details that didn't seem important at the time. Things I had brushed off without really thinking about them, like how the cabin had felt when I first arrived. I remembered unlocking the door, stepping inside, and pausing for a second. Not because anything looked wrong, but because something felt off. I had told myself it was just the quiet, just the unfamiliar space, settling in. I moved past it without questioning it. Now that moment felt different. I thought about the storage room door. I had convinced myself I might not have closed it properly, that it was just a small mistake. But what if it hadn't been like that before? The chair in the kitchen shifted in my memory too. I couldn't clearly picture what I had left it anymore. But that uncertainty didn't comfort me. It made it worse. It meant I didn't know how long things had been changing without me noticing. Even the silence itself started to feel different when I looked back on it. It hadn't felt empty when I first arrived. Not completely. There had been something underneath it. Something I couldn't define at the time. I had ignored it because there was nothing obvious to connect it to. Now there was. The footsteps didn't start when I heard them. That realization settled in slowly, like something sinking deeper the more I thought about it. I hadn't triggered anything. I hadn't caused it. I had just become aware of it, which meant it could have been moving around the cabin long before I noticed. While I was unpacking, while I was sitting in the living area, while I was lying in bed, thinking I was alone, a tight feeling formed in my chest again, sharper this time. It wasn't just fear of what was happening now. It was the thought of everything I might have missed, every moment where something could have been just out of view, just outside my awareness. I tried to retrace my steps from earlier in the day, but the more I thought about it, the less clear it became. My memory filled in the gaps with normal explanations. But now those explanations didn't feel stable anymore. They felt like assumptions, and that was the worst part. I didn't know when it started. I didn't know how long it had been there. I only knew that I hadn't noticed it until it wanted me to. I stood there in the dim light, listening again. But this time it wasn't just about waiting for the sound to return. It was about realizing that the silence I had trusted from the beginning had never really been empty at all. Leaving without proof, I didn't make a sudden decision to leave. There was no moment where everything snapped into panic. It came quietly, the same way everything else had, a steady understanding that staying there any longer didn't make sense. I didn't need to see anything else. I turned away from the hallway slowly, keeping my movements controlled, and walked back into the main room. My eyes kept shifting without meaning to, checking corners, doorways, spaces I had already looked at before. Nothing had changed, but that didn't help anymore. I moved toward my bag, which I had left near the chair, and crouched down to pick it up. The motion felt louder than it should have been, like every small sound I made echoed further than normal. I tried to keep everything quiet, careful not to rush. I didn't want to draw attention. That thought settled in without me questioning it. I packed quickly, but not frantically. Just the essential: phone, keys, a few things I could grab without making too much noise. I avoided looking back toward the hallway, even though I could feel it there behind me, like a space that hadn't gone back to being empty. I stood up slowly, adjusting the strap of the bag over my shoulder, and took a breath that didn't quite feel steady. For a moment, I just stood there, listening. The silence held for a few seconds, long enough that I almost thought it might stay that way. Then I heard it again. A single step, somewhere behind me. Not rushing, not chasing. Just there. I closed my eyes briefly, steadying myself, then opened them again, and started toward the door. I didn't look back. I didn't stop to confirm anything. I already knew what I would hear if I stood still again, and I wasn't willing to test it anymore. Another step came as I moved. Still distant, still measured. But it didn't get closer. That was the part that unsettled me more than anything else. It wasn't following me the way something would if it wanted to catch up. It wasn't reacting with urgency or aggression. It was just continuing. I reached the door and unlocked it, the sound of the mechanism sharp in the quiet. My hand hesitated on the handle for a fraction of a second, but I didn't let myself stop. I opened it and stepped outside. The air hit me immediately, cooler, more open, but it didn't feel like relief the way I expected it to. It just felt different, the kind of different that made the space behind me feel even more closed off by comparison. I stepped away from the cabin, putting distance between me and the door, but I still didn't turn around. I didn't need to. I could feel it. Not physically, not in a way I could point to, but there was a weight to the space behind me that hadn't lifted, like something was still there, just out of sight. Watching, I kept walking, steady and controlled, until I reached my car. Only then did I allow myself to move faster, opening the door and getting inside without looking back. As I shut the door, I paused for a second, my hand still on the handle, listening one last time. I didn't hear footsteps anymore, but that didn't make it feel like I had left anything behind. Closing reflection, I still listened for it. I never went back. For a while, I told myself I might, that I'd return during the day, look at everything again with a clear head, prove to myself that there had been a simple explanation. But the longer time passed, the less that idea made sense. Not because I was afraid of what I might find, but because I was more afraid of what I wouldn't. I didn't tell anyone about it, not in detail. I mentioned a trip, the cabin, how quiet it had been, but I left everything else out. There wasn't a clean way to explain it anyway. No evidence, no clear moment I could point to and say, this is what happened. It all existed in small pieces. A sound, a feeling, things that didn't quite line up. Even now, when I think about it, I can't say for certain what was real and what wasn't. But that uncertainty didn't fade over time. It stayed just beneath the surface, changing the way I notice things. Silence doesn't feel the same anymore. Before, it was something I could ignore, something that blended into the background without effort. Now, when everything goes quiet, I find myself listening more carefully than I should, waiting without meaning to. Sometimes, late at night, when everything around me settles completely, I hear something that reminds me of it. Not always, just enough. A soft step somewhere it shouldn't be. Too deliberate to be random. Too clear to dismiss entirely. And every time it happens, I stop whatever I'm doing without thinking, the same way I did back then. I listen. And just like before, the moment I move, it's gone. I've never seen anything. Never found proof of anything being there. But that doesn't change the part that stays with me the most. I don't know if it followed me, or if I just learned how to hear something that was always there.